When my little sister Victoria and I were young, I was always saving her from spiders. At night, she'd knock on the wall, and I knew that meant there was a spider in her room. So when we were older and she became the music teacher at the elementary school we went to, I teased her every chance I got, singing, "The itsy bitsy spider climbed up the water spout." But we were older, and she wasn't afraid of spiders anymore. Not as much, at least. If there was a spider in her apartment, she took care of it herself. She didn't call me and make me leave my house just to come by and rescue her from the little 8-legged monster. Victoria played piano and liked children. That's primarily how and why she got the job at our old elementary school. And as far as I know, the children loved her. On some of my days off, I went to sit in her music class. She sang Disney songs and High School Musical songs. I think she did this on purpose because she knew I hated High School Musical while we were growing up. I sat in the back of the class and watched the children jump in their seats, shout instead of sing, and laugh at the way my sister would make the piano slink up and up in sound. There was never a sad song played in that classroom. I know it. But she hasn't gone to work in months. I don't think she's even played the piano in months. I know because I've practically moved into her apartment ever since it happened. The other day, I drove Victoria to her first consult in the hospital in Boston. I'm no expert hairdresser, but I brushed and tied her hair back in a ponytail for her, all the time trying not to upset the system of masks she had on. Ever since the incident, she had been wearing surgical masks, kind you wore in COVID. She needs two, because, well, she has one covering her nose and mouth, the way you'd normally wear a mask, and she has the other one covering her chin. All that's left of my sister are her brown eyes, and I felt sick seeing how she looked at herself in the mirror while I did her hair for her that morning. We'll get this figured out, I told her, trying to look at the back of her neck instead of her reflection. Dr. Rastogi is a really good doctor. The best of the best, sis. I struggled tying her ponytail like a child learning to tie their shoes. He's done lots of pro bono work, going to Africa and fixing kids' cleft palates. She didn't respond. All she gave her reflection denied was one blink, and I didn't like what that blink relayed. Did you eat this morning? She nodded. Does your hair look good enough? I saw that her cheeks pressed up against her eyes, the only smile that she had left. All right, sis. You ready? She turned around, nodding with her head seeming very cumbersome on her neck, and nudged me out of the bathroom, closing the door when I got in the hallway. Victoria clung to me when we entered Boston General. Her head was bowed, though I'm not sure if from shame or from the additional weight beneath the mask. She averted her eyes from everyone even though nobody stared at her. I checked her in. We sat and waited, and a nurse came and escorted us to the elevator. The nurse was peppy, and I hoped that the nurse's aura would have eased Victoria while we stood in the elevator, but I knew it wouldn't. The elevator stopped and she walked us out onto the 4th floor and into a little doctor's room, where I sat in a small chair and Victoria sat on the turquoise bed with tissue paper on it. The room smelled so cold and sterile, like hand sanitizer. Dr. Rastogi will be right with you, the nurse chirped before leaving us alone. I teetered on the tightrope of what I wanted to tell her. Even though I had known her all her life, known her since Mom and Dad brought her home when I was 4, I felt it impossible to talk to her then. So I think that's why I sounded a little hesitant when I said, "The doctor's probably gonna want to see it, Vicky." She averted her face in shame. I can step outside when that time comes if you want." She didn't say anything. Of course, she didn't say anything. My heart broke for her. I was in there in her apartment to see her rip and tear up all the get well cards her students made for her. How I stuttered her name. How I approached her with my hand out as if to quell an animal, while shreds of paper snow globed the air. Dr. Rastogi came in with the brevity of having just left an opera or something. He looked sedated by some kind of entertainment we'd never comprehend, and this soothed me for some reason. I'm not sure if it soothed Victoria, though. He had black hair and a black mustache, brown skin and a kind face. He was like a gentle giant who had been shrunk to human size, as if he traded his giant stature for medical superpowers. He carried himself humbly, and I was surprised at how he sounded more English than either one of us. "Oh, hello," he said delightedly, pleased to see us. I was immediately thankful for the way he looked at Victoria. He didn't have pity in his eyes, but he looked at her like she was something beautiful that he could take care of. He looked from my sister to me and my sister again. "I'm Dr. Rastogi. You must be the loved one." "I am, Doc," I nodded, trying to sound brave. "I'm here on behalf of my sister to speak for her because..." He patted my shoulder, a single pat telling me he already understood. I got the sense that he was used to having a translator around. This was Boston General after all, and if what I read was correct, then he had traveled to more countries than I or Victoria could have dreamed of. "Dr. Rastogi," he said, shaking Victoria's hand, a handshake which made her head bob ever so slightly. "You must be Victoria," he said, and stepped back. "I assume you don't mind having your brother," I said. "Brother, filling me in on the details, do you?" She shook her head. Dr. Rastogi looked at me with stern patience in his eyes, the sudden sternness surprising me. He was getting serious. I swallowed and began. "Well, I know all of this, Doc, because Vicky wrote all of it down in a notebook in the weeks after her, surgery." "Where was the surgery performed?" "Salem Hospital," I answered him. I had never known my sister struggled with self-image, and I don't think anyone in our family knew she was looking at getting plastic surgery done. "And what plastic surgery was it meant to be?" he asked. I circled my hand in front of my mouth to indicate. "Some kind of jaw correction, something. I don't remember, Doc. I always thought she was fine and okay just the way she was. Boys always liked her in high school. I don't know why." He patted my shoulder again. That's all right. "I'm sorry, Doc. I should have brought the notebook, but I didn't because I read so many times because I couldn't believe what I was reading. I memorized most of it. So, tell me most of it if you can." She said in her notebook that the doctor who had agreed to work on her was named Dr. Leek. She said he was a tall and charismatic man in their consults, and that he was very gentle, tapping his fingers under her chin and examining her jaw. He was very polite and mindful, white, brown hair, freshly shaven, He showed her examples of successful surgeries, before and after kind of pictures. They considered each possible new chin or jaw or whatever together, and after careful deliberation, the surgery was planned on a day in December during the Christmas break. She's a music teacher and has the benefits of week-long vacations during the school year. Dr. Rastogi turned to Victoria and asked, "Give or take, answering with your fingers, how many years did you struggle with insecurities related to your face?" "Since middle school, Doc," I answered for her. "Were you bullied?" he asked her. "Not that I'm aware of." I again answered for her, and I wanted to add that I wish I had known, if so, because I wouldn't have let that slide. I had too much anger welling up in me. But we didn't know where Dr. Leake was. "Did Dr. Leake explain his credentials?" he asked her, to which she nodded, the nod being a great exercise for her to do. He asked a follow-up question. "Now, how nervous were you going into this procedure?" "She was excited," I said. "Were there any assistants or anesthesiologists in the operating room when you went in?" he asked, and Victoria nodded. "Now, did they inject the anesthesia or give it to you via a mask?" "Injection," I said. Dr. Rastogi chuckled to himself. Pardon me. Now, I know this might be a tricky question as neither of you are medically inclined or taught, but did Dr. Leake explain what he did when you came to?" I felt my eyes prematurely widen when I watched Victoria nod. Her eyes shrank, desperate to hide from the world. I swallowed again and started playing with my fingers. "Was that in the notebook?" Dr. Rastogi queried me. It was my turn to nod, and it felt just as difficult as it must have for Victoria. I felt my face spasm, eyebrows up, cheeks caving in to see another swallow sail away. It was, Doc. All of it. I don't know how she remembered it so well to write all of it down, and I don't know how I'm able to remember it so well too. I wish neither of us did. It's imperative I know what measures Dr. Leake took, Dr. Rastogi explained. You are a very brave woman, Victoria. But I think it's time your brother be a little brave for you too. Can I get you a cup of water? I waved my hand. No, Doc. Do you want to step out for this part, Vicky? Dr. Rastogi and I waited, but her eyes were stuck in their turtle shell eye sockets. But eventually the memories bested her and she nodded like never before. She bobbed her head frantically. Dr. Rastogi called a nurse, and the nurse came to wait with Victoria in the hallway while Dr. Rastogi and I talked. An apocalypse came into the little room when it was just him and I. I could say anything now. I could say how hurt I was, how angry, how sick I was. But he had seen this kind of look in many parents and family members before, and he kept himself composed while I struggled to speak. I assure you they won't be able to hear us, he told me. Now, it's imperative that you don't leave out any details, especially the details you don't want to say. I nodded, beginning to explain. Dr. Leake waited for Victoria to come to, waiting for the anesthesia to wear off and waiting for her body to recover because I think he wanted her to be completely lucid when he explained. There were bandages wrapped all around her mouth. She couldn't really feel anything yet, but she saw him in the white recovery room, looming over her and looking down at her like she was some gold medal gymnast and he was her coach, and she had just beaten some record or something. Go on. He explained to her that what he did was experimental, and that she would get accustomed to it, saying that it had been a motive for consuming food for millions of years. He said that once he removed the bandages that she would be able to feel her new mouth twitching, and that was when he carefully undid the bandages. He helped her sit up in the hospital bed while revolving his hand around her head. She felt her new mouth kind of fall out of the bandages it had been slinged in. And at first she felt kind of relief, like her mouth could stretch like the way you stretch after being asleep for so long. Dr. Leek went to discard the bandages, which didn't have any blood on them at all. That's how good of a surgeon he was. And he looked for a mirror in the cabinet. Dr. Rastogi nodded at me, his eyes so intent. I continued. Well, while he was looking for the mirror, he started explaining what he had done. I've always been interested in the oral cavities of arachnids, he said while looking for a mirror. My sister sat there in the bed, confused as to why he was telling her that. Dr. Leek went on. Hundreds of millions of years ago, there was a millipede the size of a car. But spiders have never exceeded the size of the Goliath bird eater. I have always wondered what a spider would look like, what its mouth would look like if it exceeded its limit in size. And he found a handheld mirror and brought it over to Victoria. I stopped. It felt like my eyelids had receded into my skull. My eyes were that wide. I wondered if I would ever blink or sleep again. Do you need a minute? No, Doc, I can do this. And I did. I continued. Well, he walked over to her bed and handed her the mirror. Her lips were gone. The lower half of her face had been replaced by a spider's mouth with big fat pincers and a weird hairy appendages that cowered behind the big pincers. How did Dr. Lake gather the biological materials to build this arachnid phagy? Huh? Spider's mouth. I swallowed again and looked around the room, speaking. Oh, yeah, he told her. He got it all from her. The fangs on the pincers were from the bones in her big toes. I clapped my hand to my mouth. I felt the meat on my thigh bones trembling. He got most of the flesh from small deposits of muscle and fat from her biceps and thighs. And he got the hair from skin grafts from her pelvic region. The hair being. I stopped myself. Is there a bathroom nearby, Doc? To the right, down the hall. Thank you. I sprung up, exited the room and hurried into the restroom and vomited. The nurse and Victoria were sitting in a waiting room down the hall. I only noticed this when I got back to the little room where Dr. Rastogi was. Can you fix this, Doc? I'll have to have a look. From what you tell me, it sounds like the damage is extensive. Tell me, is she seeing a psychologist? She can't anymore, Doc. It might be a good idea to find one, he said. I don't know why, but the following jetted out of me. She can't close her mouth. He hid little mucus deposits in there, so it's always wet. Was I beginning to cry? I don't know, but the doctor listened to me with the same respect he had been displaying the whole time. "I think you've told me enough," he said, and I felt relieved. "Now, do you know the whereabouts of Dr. Leek?" I shook my head. "Don't you think I tried finding him, Doc?" "Don't yet. Think about your sister now. You can bring her in now. I'm going to examine her. I understand if you have to step out." "No," I snarled. "I have to see what this bastard did." "You mean you haven't seen it yet?" "No." Dr. Rastogi took a deep breath, as if remembering similar situations. And judging by the look in his eyes, all situations ended similarly, with the loved ones running out of the room crying, I imagine. We brought Victoria back in the room and sat back down on the turquoise bed with tissue paper. The cold hand sanitizer smell seemed to flex itself upon her entrance. Dr. Rastogi washed his hands in a little sink in the room and turned around. "Is it okay if I have a look, Victoria?" She nodded. "Your brother said he would stay for this part. Is that okay with you?" Victoria turned her head, her brown eyes alive with terror. It made me miss when we were little and the only spiders were the ones in our bedrooms. There was a begging trust in all that terror, and she nodded. I nodded back at her, bracing myself. Dr. Rastogi's hands came out slowly and undid the 2 COVID masks she was wearing. A garbled sob came out of my sister, muffled and far away. Trapped. She sounded like someone locked in a chest. Both Dr. Rastogi and I tried to remain composed. Her pincer dropped out, and the tinier appendages behind them twitched awake. I could see yellowing fangs at the end of each pincer that were really her big toe bones. I saw the hair, brown, stubble, moist tubes of flesh that looked full of pus or something. I could hear the dripping mucus from inside the cavity that used to be her mouth. My stomach threw itself against the wall of my belly, looking for an escape. I did my best not to cry. I had already thrown up. "Vicky," I murmured helplessly. Her pincers reached out to Dr. Rastogi but couldn't reach him. I leaned forward in my seat and started crying. I wanted to look away, but I forced myself to watch the doctor hold one pincer in his hands and then examine the other one. I watched him hold a little flashlight in front of the abomination. Victoria has a long road ahead. So do I. I've taken up smoking. I puked after my first try, though I'm not sure if it's from what I've seen, what I know my sister is going through, or just from that virgin cigarette. I've been living in her apartment, taking care of her. Other than her abnormality, we live a pretty calm and reclusive life. Thankfully, the media hasn't caught wind of what has happened. God, I don't think she'd be able to handle that. I have changed too. I found a tiny jumping spider crawling down the living room wall the other day while Victoria was in her room. I got a piece of paper and a cup and scooped the little fella in between them and carried him outside into the apartment parking lot. And though he was very little, while I was on my knees on the pavement, I thought I saw him look up at me confused. He had big pincers too, and cute black eyes, but he looked very confused as to why I saved him.